For your ears only for the week of October 13th and Columbus Day, I'm David Alpern.
I'm Eddie Robinson.
I would hope that the president will look at this as an opportunity and a good faith effort on our part to move halfway to what he's demanded in order to have these conversations begin.
None of us know what's going to happen on this Obamacare fight right now. In my view, the House of Representatives needs to keep doing what it's been doing, which is standing strong. We need to go back to the American people.
In fact, last week's halfway offer by House Speaker John Boehner for a 6-week extension on the debt ceiling in exchange for more comprehensive budget talks, but no end to the federal shutdown, did not go far enough for President Obama. But while talks on something similar continued in the Senate, Democrats in the House moved ahead with a discharge petition for a majority of most Democrats and enough Republicans to vote on a no-strings continuing resolution to reopen the government along lines that the Senate has already approved, all of which left GOP Senator Ted Cruz of Texas increasingly isolated in rearguard opposition to Obamacare.
While Cruz drew cheers at the Value Voters Summit, a new NBC Wall Street Journal poll underscored how much the American people disagreed. By a widening 53 to 21% margin, blame for the shutdown went to the Republican Party rather than President Obama. Just 24% still had a favorable view of the GOP, only 21% for the Tea Party, all-time lows for both. And by 47 to 39%, those surveyed preferred a Democratic-controlled Congress next year. Obamacare itself ticked up in favorability from 31 to 38%. To discuss all that and efforts to avoid such partisan logjams in the future, we're joined again by Julian Zelizer, Princeton professor of history and public affairs, author of Jimmy Carter and Governing America. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
How unprecedented is holding government funding hostage to reversing a piece of standing legislation like Obamacare or forcing major spending changes outside the normal legislative process?
Well, we've seen government shutdown since the mid-1970s. They've often been the result of the parties unable to reach resolution on particular spending within the budget. So in the 1970s, there were a few shutdowns over Medicaid spending for abortion. The most comparable moment is in the mid-90s when Newt Gingrich and the House Republicans forced a shutdown over Medicare funding. But this is a little unprecedented in that we're now talking not about how to spend on a particular program, but just repealing a program altogether that left us where we are today. So clearly, I think we've seen this tactic now go to a new level.
Are there really enough House districts where voters could be so disaffected by the shutdown they swing away from the GOP and give Democrats control?
There could be. I think, the polls for the Republicans are quite bad. We're only starting to see the effects of the shutdown right now. It's starting to trickle down after 7 days, and we're starting to hear more not just about furloughs, but the effects of the government shutdown. And obviously the fears over what would happen if if Congress does not raise the debt ceiling are pretty big. So I do think the effects could be bigger than Republicans think, even in these hardcore Republican Tea Party districts.
Presuming that the government does reopen sometime soon and that the debt ceiling is raised in time to avoid any serious default, you say the current chaos may actually set the stage for reforms that prevent it from happening again. Watergate provides an example.
Well, yeah, after Watergate, we go through a period where there's all kinds of government reforms ranging from, opening government hearings to the independent prosecutor law. It was just a period of frustration in that decade where people thought government wasn't working, it was corrupt. We don't have the same kind of corruption scandal right now, but clearly the levels of frustration with dysfunctional government are very high, and Republicans are taking the blame. That combination could lead to elections where Democrats use the issue of reform, budget reform, campaign finance reform, as a theme to distinguish their party and appeal to voters, not just loyal Democrats, but moderates and even some Republicans in conservative states who are just frustrated with the status quo.
Do you see mainstream GOP funders really doing more to fight extreme candidates, back moderates, even switch to Democrats in some districts?
There's a lot of evidence they're ready to do that, including business, which has all the money and resources in the world. They do not like what's happening because ultimately this affects their bottom line. line. So from Republicans such as a Karl Rove, who believe this is detrimental to the party, to business leaders who traditionally support Republicans but are fearful about the economic consequences of this ongoing budget war, I think, there could be a lot of support, not necessarily for Democrats winning all over, but for Democrats winning in enough districts combined with challenges to Tea Party Republicans that the dynamics of the GOP change significantly.
Ironically, though, the Supreme Court has already cut out one key post-Watergate campaign finance reform and now has another in its sights, as we'll discuss in the next segment. What could a new Democratic-controlled Congress do about that?
Well, Congress always has the ability to pass new legislation and to put together campaign reforms that won't be knocked down as unconstitutional. So they would have to work around Citizen United, and we'll have to see what the court rules on individual contributions. But clearly there's areas such as public funding and other kinds of restrictions on private donations that are clearly constitutional and could be put into place. So it's a big issue, and a lot of the budget reform is driven by candidates and politicians who are appealing to loyal activists and donors who like these kinds of stands.
You say reform of the federal budget process itself must be the first focus of reform. Talk about some of the specific ideas floating around, including a link to congressional pay.
Yeah, there's all kinds of proposals left and right. Some say that if the budget is not done on time, if the budget is not completed, there should be a penalty on congressional pay. This came out of the Brookings Institution, I believe. There's others who say that, we should get rid of the debt ceiling or, revise the debt ceiling so that it's only done every few years and only deals with certain kinds of funding, which would be constitutional and certainly within the parameters of what Congress could do to take away this tool from the opposition and to get us out of really having this economic threat over our head all the time. And there's others who talk about centralizing the budget process more to make it more rational, or to do it every 2 years rather than one on many programs. So there's all kinds of ideas out there, and it's these kinds of crises which often open a window for real reform.
Does more use of discharge petitions in the House provide the means for a bipartisan majority to recapture control from a minority of Republican conservatives who recently have controlled what Speaker Boehner brings up for a vote?
It could. This was a tool that civil rights activists actually used in the late 1950s and early 1960s to finally get civil rights out of the hands of Southern Democrats who were conservatives. Northern Democrats allied with liberal Republicans, and they used the discharge petition and the threat of a discharge petition to force older conservatives like Howard Smith of Virginia to let legislation come to the floor. So these are the kinds of tools that have been used in the past, often with bipartisan coalitions, to change a Congress that seems broken.
Princeton professor of history and public affairs Julian Zelizer. His books include Jimmy Carter and Governing America.
Quote from the news, "It slipped through the cracks." That was a veteran law enforcement official on a 2009 CIA report, never acted on, about suspicious conduct by employee Edward Snowden, later the contractor who leaked extensive NSA secrets.
Next, campaigns, cash, and the court. For your ears only.